But okay, yeah. So let's just start with a little bit of breathing meditation to settle our minds. And then let's, while we're still in a meditative mode, let's take just a few minutes to cultivate great love, great compassion, and bodhicitta. I think you all know how to do that. So just take a few moments of silence to cultivate bodhicitta. Hmm. Okay, so with that bodhicitta in our minds, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Oops. Recording. Good to see everybody. Let's see, and we're in necklace of for those of clear awareness. We're up to page 58 for those who are following along in the text. And so, and just a reminder, we were on the 6 root mental afflictions, right? And you all know we covered this last time, but yeah, anyway, so that it's funny, right? When we say arhat, right? The arhat, foe destroyer, right? Which is one of the epithets of both Hinayana practitioners or individual vehicle liberation practitioners who achieve liberation, and also an epithet of the Buddha, right? So it means a foe destroyer, right? So these are the foes that one destroys, right? Mental affliction. That's one thing. One of the things I love about Buddhism is that one's foes are not external; they're internal. It's like our foes are our own mental afflictions, not somebody outside of ourselves. It's a good thing. And so we're up to ignorance. And so, so we'll just continue on there. So it says, regarding ignorance, the compendium of knowledge says, what is ignorance? And it says, it is the unknowing of the 3 realms that has the function of acting as a support for the arising of wrong ascertainment, doubt, and afflictions with respect to phenomena. One thing I want to point out briefly is I was contrasting that definition, which I guess comes from Asanga, with an Arch translation, one that comes from Vasubandhu. So in that quote, it said, ignorance is the absence of knowledge with regards to karma and its results, the 4 noble truths, and the 3 jewels. And in Geshe Rabdin's book, he says something similar to that definition, where he says, ignorance is an afflicted state of unknowing brought about by a mind that is unclear regarding the nature of such things as karma and the 3 jewels. It functions as the basis and root for all the other afflictions and defiled states, as well as the states of rebirth that they produce. The reason why I wanted to just explore that for a moment is you'll see, because we're going to get into the 5 afflicted Jews. And I just wanted to point something out, which is that I want to say the way our text that we're going to cover discusses ignorance, it has a kind of broader definition in some sense. And I was sort of reflecting on this, this is my own reflection, so it didn't come in any of the commentaries. But if you take Vasubandhu's definition, right, which I said was ignorance being an absence of knowledge with regards to karma and its results, the 4 noble truths, and the 3 jewels, it's easier for there not to be an overlap with the 5 afflicted views. Whereas when you take the broader definition that Kachin Yeshi Gelson is going to give, then for me it was harder to have there not be an overlap of where ignorance and some of the afflicted views could sort of overlap. So that was just sort of, if you're trying, it might be if you're trying to do categorization or something, then maybe Vasubandhu's definition is simpler. Whereas I think Kachin Yeshi Gelson is also quite useful. So anyway, there are just slightly different glosses or something on the definition of ignorance, but as one of the 6 root mental afflictions. And I'll just continue on. We'll cover the rest of the definition as we go along, so I'll just keep going. So it says, just as it has been said above, it is a mental factor, right, of unknowing that is obscured regarding the mode of abiding of phenomena. And then I'll just say that it's of 2 types: the obscuration that is a mental factor of unknowing, and an awareness that apprehends erroneously. And so I wanted to pause there and reflect on this a little bit, right? Because so it's saying there are 2 different. It's saying there are 2 different types of ignorance, right? One is an ignorance where you don't know something, right? So in other words, if nobody's ever told you about karma, for example, right, then you just don't know about it, so you're ignorant of it, right? And then there's another kind of ignorance that apprehends, and that's passive in a way, right? That's a passive kind of ignorance, right? And then there's an active kind of ignorance where you actively apprehend something incorrectly. And I just want to pause there, just because I think this is useful. I mean, we'll talk about this in a second from a Buddhist perspective, but this is true in general, isn't it? And there was like, yeah, like if somebody were to ask me like the details of string theory in physics, I would have to say, well, I would be of the first, right? In other words, I have some very vague idea what that is, but if you ask me the details, I would have to say I have an ignorance that's an unknowing, right? In other words, I haven't read enough and studied enough about it, so I don't. And that's not an active misapprehension; it's just a simple not knowing, right? But then, and so we can identify that in our own experience, right? You can, I mean, actually, each of us can have countless examples, right, of things, objects of knowledge that we don't know. One way is that Buddhas don't have that, right? In other words, that's why when they say Buddha is omniscient, they don't have a quality. In other words, they say Buddhas know all existent phenomena, and if there's something that's not existent, Buddha knows that it's non-existent. So this first one, there's the mental factor that simply doesn't know something. You know, Buddha doesn't have that mental factor, but in the case of someone like myself, there are an infinite number of examples, right? Like, you know, what's it like on the dark side of the moon, or if they're right, and you know, whatever. There are countless examples, right, about like undersea creatures and so on. So that's a passive kind of unknowing where you simply haven't learned something. And then there's a second kind, which is an awareness that apprehends erroneously. And unfortunately, that one also, there are countless examples, aren't there? In Buddhism, the most famous one, of course, would be apprehending a, you know, let's say a truly existent self where there isn't one, right? That would be the most important awareness that apprehends. So it's an active misapprehension, right? Where you're perceiving a self, a kind of self that you're perceiving and apprehending and grasping at a kind of self as existing somewhere where it doesn't exist. Right? But there are countless other examples of apprehending erroneously, right? Like anything from like very mundane examples, like, you know, thinking that, well, actually, like when you're angry, I'll give a very simple example, right? When we're angry at somebody, we have this kind of erroneous apprehension where we see them as all bad, right? When you're really mad at somebody, you think, oh, they're terrible and they're like this, like that, and we exaggerate. Actually, this is part of the nature of anger, right, or desire. We exaggerate the qualities of the object. So those are whatever active misapprehensions, right, that are a kind of ignorance. Yeah. Anyway, so and we do those all the time, right? I mean, there are grosser examples where we sort of project onto people things and groups of people and project onto places all kinds of things that are, what's the word, where we're apprehending erroneously. We're actually projecting something onto the thing that doesn't exist. So you get the idea. So so one point I wanted to make, though, is just if you think about this one, that distinction is interesting to contemplate in terms of your oneself, right? Like, what am I ignorant about? And then we'll continue on because it's going to explain that more now. So it says, from among these two, the explicit indication in the Abhidharma, right, in the Compendium of Knowledge, explains ignorance to be a mental factor of a knowing. That's the first of the two, right? And then it says, since Acharya Vasubandhu also explained it this way in his discussion of the five aggregates, that's so the first one, Compendium of Knowledge, is the text by Asanga, and the second, a discussion of the five aggregates, he's referring to a text by Vasubandhu. They were brothers or half brothers. So they both agree that so those two authors, right, agree that it's number one, that the ignorance referred to here is an unknowing, right? So they both agree that that's the case. And so that's what I was getting at earlier, right? So in other words, for Asanga and Vasubandhu, this mental factor of ignorance is where you simply don't know something that's of spiritual importance. And part of what that implies here is that, you know, if you don't know, you know, if you don't know how to fix a refrigerator by yourself, that wouldn't be this kind of ignorance, because it's not spiritually significant. It's not getting in the way of your spiritual development necessarily. Actually, a Sangha wouldn't have known how to fix a refrigerator because there weren't any at his time, right? So that wouldn't be, that wouldn't be a factor here. But it's ignorance about things like, that's why the examples, right, that are given in those texts. An example like not knowing about the Four Noble Truths, not knowing about karma and its results, not knowing about the three jewels, then you can't practice the path, right? And one way of saying that, so it's like a not, it'd be like if a person, so to say, right, like, if in order to be happy you needed to get somewhere, but you didn't know that place existed and you didn't know the way to get there, then you're stuck, right? So in this case, it's like that, right? Whereas the happiness is, comes about, for example, in part, mundane happiness comes about through guarding karma. But if you don't know about that, then you can't guard karma, right? The three jewels and the Four Noble Truths, if you want to achieve liberation, you need to know about those. But if you don't know about them, you can't go to liberation. So they're saying this kind of ignorance is like that. It's a not knowing about the things that you need to know about in order to bring about your own or others' welfare. Now I want to contrast that. So then he says, our author says, and this is why our author is using a broader definition, is he's not limiting himself to what Sangha and Vasubandhu say. So he says, however, Acharya Dharmakirti, right? Dharmakirti is the great author of the text on Pramana. So Acharya Dharmakirti asserts ignorance to be an awareness that apprehends erroneously. So Dharmakirti is saying, no, it's number two. It's the erroneous misapprehension, right? He's given, and he says, in this way, there are two types of assertions regarding ignorance. One, the assertion that it is a wrong conception, and two, the assertion that it is an awareness that does not realize. By the way, it's a little confusing there. He's flipped the two, right? He flipped the order of those two. So don't get confused there, right? Here number one here is number two above, and number two here is number one above. But he's saying it's the same two types, right? And he says both. So he says some authors, meaning those who follow Asanga and Vasubandhu, are asserting that ignorance, as one of the root mental affections, is an unknowing, is a passive, just not knowing something. Dharmakirti, on the other hand, is saying ignorance is something that apprehends erroneously, right? That knows wrongly. And then our author says both are alike in asserting that the principal antidote to ignorance is the wisdom realizing selflessness. So I just want to point this out, right? So Kachin Geshe Gyaltsen is taking two different views from historical Buddhist teachers and saying he's giving a definition that's broad enough to encompass both, and saying, in his view, ignorance is more useful, it's more practical to take a view of ignorance that encompasses both of those kinds of definitions. And of course, we have both of those kinds of ignorance, and so and what he's getting at here, right, is that, well, anyway, I'll get to that later because it comes up. So now he says, now he points out, now he's going to give it, so that's the end of that section, right? So he's pointing out there are two types of ignorance in general, in that sense, right? The not knowing and the knowing erroneously. Now he's going to say another categorization. So this is a separate categorization. Ignorance is of two types. One, ignorance that is an obscuration with respect to actions and their results. And two, ignorance is an obscuration with respect to the meaning of suchness, right? Of emptiness, of how things are. Then he says, ignorance is an obscuration with respect to actions and their results, meaning karma, right, causes one to accumulate actions for rebirth in the lower realms. So what's he getting at here, right? He said, now he's getting at, and this is taught in the Lamrim also, right? He's saying, and by the way, ignorance with regards to karma, right? So if we don't know what to adopt and what to abandon karmically, then we'll do actions that cause suffering to ourselves and others. And the result of that will be that we'll take rebirth in the three lower realms, right? And so he's saying, from a practical perspective, that's an extremely, actually, you could say for us as beginners, that's the most important kind of ignorance for beginners to address. because if we don't learn about karma and its results, then we won't get a human rebirth again, and we won't be able to continue our spiritual practice, right? And will mainly cause suffering to ourselves and others. And by the way, so with regards to this kind of ignorance, right, the ignorance with regards to actions and results, it's one example of the passive kind of ignorance, right, above, right, the not knowing, the simply not knowing. And so the antidote to that is study, right, is studying the teachings on karma, right, so learning. In other words, and if we learn the teachings on karma and contemplate them and think about them, then we can get better and better at not doing things that cause suffering, right? And that will help us get better rebirths and be happy in this life and also in future lives, basically. So that one, the antidote to that is learning. And then he says, ignorance that is an obscuration with respect to the meaning of suchness causes one to accumulate actions for circling in good migrations. So what does that mean, actually? Actually, because it also causes us to, by the way, so it's kind of funny, isn't it? Ignorance with regards to suchness can cause both, in general, can cause us to do actions that lead to lower realms and higher realms, right? In other words, because when we don't understand the nature of self and of objects, we do all kinds of things. But here what he's getting at is a practical point, which is that if you don't know about karma, there's a kind of nihilism that happens, right? I often think this, I'll just say it, I often think the culture, actually, yeah, I don't know, the culture I live in is that culture, actually, right? The culture that I live in is the culture that doesn't understand karma and that therefore creates undue suffering, right? It's a culture, there is any culture that doesn't understand karma will do that. Any person that, right, because if you don't understand karma, right, then if you're angry at somebody, if your culture is angry at somebody else, and you understand karma, then you make war, right? Where does all the environmental problems we have, like global warming, come from this, right? From not understanding causality, right? But what this is getting at is the second kind, so it's a kind of nihilism. The second kind, ignorance with regards to suchness, what he's getting at there, because on the one hand, you could say ignorance with regards to suchness is the cause of all of samsara, right? But here he has an implication, I think, that he's getting at, which Khensa Rinpoche has made before also, which is that if you understand karma, what he's implying is this: if you understand karma, but you still grasp at a self, then you want to protect that self, right? And so there's a kind of, what's the word, reification, actually, that's going on, that up to a certain point is good, actually. Whereas if you're grasping at a self of persons, if you're saying, I truly exist, and I don't want to suffer, so I'm not going to harm others, and I'm not going to follow greed, and I'm not going to follow, up to a certain point, that's a good thing, because you'll protect yourself. What does the Dalai Lama say? Wise selfishness. If up to a certain point, if you don't understand suchness and you grasp at a self of yourself, but you think, I want to protect myself, so I'm not going to harm others, I'm going to be gentle, I'm going to be nonviolent, I'm going to be generous, and so on, that's good in the sense that it will cause you to have good migrations, actually, right? You'll guard karma, you'll be wisely selfish, but you won't achieve liberation, right? You have to understand suchness or emptiness in order to achieve liberation. So even though in general, not understanding suchness is the cause of all of samsara, from a practical perspective he's getting at here, there's a value to that up to a point. Does that make sense? And actually, if you think in the Lamrim, like the low scope, that's what that is, actually, right? The person has no interest in, when you're when you're practicing in common with the person of low scope and you're in that focus, then the focus is, how do I not go to lower realms, right? And if you're, it's implicit that you are still grasping at a self of persons at that point. But you're going to protect karma, so so you'll go, as he says here, you'll accumulate actions for circling in good migrations, but you won't achieve liberation. So to understand, you have to understand suchness in order to achieve liberation. Then it says, its function is specified as acting as a support for the arising of wrong ascertainment, doubt, and afflictions with respect to phenomena, because other afflictions arise in dependence upon ignorance, and in dependence upon them, i.e. the afflictions, karma arises. And in dependence upon karma or actions, all sufferings of samsara, cyclic existence, arise. Therefore, all afflictions and faults arise in dependence upon ignorance. I'm going to say this is similar to a quote, a famous quote that both Lama Tsongkhapa and His Holiness Dalai Lama both often quote, where I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but Aryadeva in his 400 stanzas says, I would just to remind myself of it, but it's, just as the body sense pervades all the other sense powers and faculties, just so does ignorance pervade all mental afflictions. And what's he getting at there? Like, what he's getting at, what Aryadeva is saying is like we have the remember the 6 sense powers, right? Or well, you could say the 5 in the body, 5 senses of the body, right? There he's talking about. So so even if you're like the way you think is your eyes see, right? They're the visual sense power, but if you press on them, you still feel, right? Your ears hear, but if you whack them, they still, it'll still hurt, and so on. In other words, so the bodily sense power, that kind of our body sense pervades the others. In other words, you can't see with your fingertips, but you can feel tactily with your eyeball, right? With your eye. You can't hear with your toe, but you can feel with your ear, and so on, right? And then your nose and everything. So he's saying the bodily sense power pervades the other sense power, the other sense faculties. What Aryadeva is getting at is he's saying, in a similar way, ignorance, this mental affliction, pervades all the other mental afflictions. It's within all the other mental afflictions. And that's kind of like what, that's the same point that our author is making here, which is that, so how does he say it? The other afflictions arise in dependence upon ignorance. In dependence upon them. So what he's getting at here is this, is how does samsara happen, right? So ignorance is the root, is the most foundational one. Based on ignorance, right, grasping, in particular, well, based on ignorance, let's just say it that way, we then give rise to the other mental afflictions, such as desire and anger and so on. Based on those mental afflictions, we create karma, and that's the process of samsara, right? It's karma and mental afflictions that drives samsara and the 12 links of dependent arising. We learn that, right? So he's saying basically that this mental affliction, ignorance, is the root of samsara, is the root of all suffering. He's reminding us of that. And you know that, I mean, actually, if you look in the sutras, right, sometimes when you look in the Buddha's sutras, sometimes it'll say desire is the root of, is the mental affliction that's the root of all suffering. And sometimes it'll say ignorance is in different other sutras. And actually, I think those are 2 different presentations based on level of subtlety. Whereas for somebody who doesn't really understand what ignorance is yet, then you can identify desire because it's easier to identify in our own experience. We all know what desire is like. We live in the desire realm. But the actual root of suffering is ignorance, because ignorance underlies desire. It's more subtle than desire. It's the basis from which desire arises. So the actual root of samsara is ignorance. So then he quotes Dharmakirti, his commentary on Pramana Vartika. One who sees the self will constantly adhere to it as I. Due to this adherence, one will crave for happiness, and due to that craving, faults will be hidden from view. Right, so he's getting at very clearly there, right? When you see it, a substantial, self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? Then you adhere to it, to that sense of I. Due to that, you crave for your own happiness, right? And you don't realize, and it's interesting the way he phrased it, right? Faults will be hidden from view. It's getting at a very practical thing, isn't it? Which is that we don't realize then. Like, in other words, it's actually similar to what Shantideva says, where he says, although sentient beings don't want suffering, they run towards suffering. Although sentient beings want happiness, they destroy their own happiness. Right? Shantideva puts it that way. Dharmakirti is getting at the same point here, which is, because we have ignorance grasping at a self, right, at a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, then we want happiness for that, for ourselves, right? And where he says faults will be hidden from view, we don't realize, right? So in other words, we follow desire, trying to make that self be happy. And yet by following desire, we're causing ourselves suffering, right? Then we try to defend that self, right? We get angry at somebody who does something we don't like. And we think we're trying to protect the self, but we're actually harming ourselves. Does that make sense? So where he says faults will be hidden from view, that's the nature of ignorance, isn't it? Is when we're under the control of ignorance, as Shantideva put it, right? We want to be happy, but we destroy our happiness. We don't want suffering, but in our process of trying to avoid suffering, we create suffering. And that's what samsara is actually, and it all comes from ignorance is the point here. So that's the meaning of hidden from view. It's hidden from our view because we don't see it accurately, whereas we don't see things accurately, and therefore, we perpetuate our own suffering. Then he goes on. Dharmakirti goes on. All faults have as their root the view of the transitory collection, that is ignorance. From it, attachment arises. From it, hatred and so forth arises. The Buddha himself taught that the cause of these faults is ignorance. So you see my point there. I just want to point out, right? Like he's actually getting at the psychological process, right? From ignorance comes attachment. From attachment comes hatred, and from it, right? Meaning from attachment come hatred and all the other mental afflictions. So that's why you can see why I mentioned earlier, the Buddha sometimes would say it's attachment or desire that's the root of suffering. That's for somebody who can't see what ignorance is yet, right? They can see, oh, I have attachment. And then because we're attached, we get angry at people, we get prideful, right? As last time we were talking about, we can have pride, that sort of defend our sense of I. We can get angry because somebody's insulting our sense of I. We can have jealousy because somebody has something our sense of I doesn't have, and so on. So all of those come from attachment, but attachment itself comes from ignorance. That's what he's getting at. And Dharmakirti was a logician, right? So he's pointing out a kind of causal sequence here. So he says that's why the Buddha taught the cause of all these faults is ignorance, right? So all the mental afflictions arise from ignorance in that way. And then he goes on, all faults have it as their root, the view of the transitory collection. And I won't go into detail about this term transitory collection because that comes up in the section on the 5 afflicted views. So we'll talk about that more in detail in that section. And then the foremost Lama Tsongkhapa in his Essence of Eloquence, Essence of Excellent Explanations, praise to the Lord Muni for his teaching on, yes, this is the short Essence of Eloquence. There are 2 Essence of Eloquences the Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. This is the brief one that he wrote on the morning of his enlightenment, the morning of his realizing emptiness. So he says, the root of all misery in the world is ignorance. That is overcome by seeing the dependent arising that you have taught. He's praising the Buddha for teaching dependent arising in that text. Lama Tsongkhapa is. Actually, I want to just, So why, I just want to pause for a second. Why is Kachin Yeshe Gelsen quoting, we hear he gave 3 quotes from Dharmakirti and 1 from Tsongkhapa about ignorance being the root of the mental afflictions. I just want to point out, ultimately, I don't know why some bodhisattva like Kachin Yeshe Gelsen does anything, but we can say, seems like he's saying it. Why? For us to develop enthusiasm for overcoming our own ignorance, right? In other words, he's saying actually, because it's how, sorry, I say this right. We develop enthusiasms for all kinds of things, don't we? Based on what we hear is good, And what Kachin Yeshe Gelsen here is doing when he's talking about the mental affliction of ignorance is he's saying that he's basically implying, right? The reason I'm explaining this is because it's the cause of your suffering, right? It's actually an expression of his compassion that he's saying this. He's saying, he's like a kind parent actually saying to us, the reader, right? You suffer and you don't know why you suffer. Even if you've heard the teachings, you don't really know because your effort isn't directed towards realizing dependent arising, right? And he's saying, if you really understood the cause of your own suffering, then what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? Then you would your main effort in life would be to understand dependent arising. Right? Everything else would be secondary to that, because that's the way to be free from suffering. Does that make sense? So this, I believe, is an expression of his compassion, saying to us that, right? And again, it's not saying it to somebody other than us, right? Because we're the ones who are subject to such suffering, because we still have ignorance. So he's trying to encourage us, actually, right, to develop a kind of energy and enthusiasm for, I said it at the beginning of this, like the arhat is one who has overcome the foe, the inner foe. He's saying, actually, it's like that, it's kind of like that, right? Like, in other words, if you think of it like because the arhat is a metaphor, right, for like a battle, right, overcoming your enemy, but your enemy's inside, right? And what it's getting at in a way is like, if there's an actual battle, right, going on externally, like, that's what I say, right? If you kill the leader of the enemy force, then the enemy force will collapse, right? Otherwise, if you just keep fighting, what's the word, or like the poor people who are just drafted or something, then it just goes on and on, right? It's like the war in Ukraine, isn't it? They kill so many people, right? Like, so many people die, but as long as, like, especially Vladimir Putin could just keeps drafting people, right? He'll just draft somebody else and send them. It doesn't care if they die. Right? If Vladimir Putin were to die, then the war would end, probably. Anyway, it's a metaphor. But what it's getting at here is that the root of all the mental afflictions, so the main enemy, is this ignorance. Right? And if you get rid of that, all the other mental afflictions, so all your other enemies will fall over. It'd be like that. If you can kill that enemy inside yourself, then all the other mental affliction enemies will fall down, will stop functioning, and you'll be free from suffering. So he's saying, really develop enthusiasm for overcoming this mental affliction, and all the other mental afflictions will also stop. And so that's what he says. So in brief, this ignorance is the root of circling in the three realms of cyclic existence, since it is the basis for all actions and afflictions, right? So karma and mental afflictions. Ignorance is taught at the beginning of the 12 links of dependent arising, right, as the root cause of all suffering. And so it's like, I take that as him almost like begging us, please try to overcome your ignorance, right? Like, because that's your way of freeing yourself from suffering. That's your way of benefiting the world, is to overcome your own ignorance. So I take that Geshe Gelsen kind of like that. So that's the end of that section on that mental affliction. Any questions on the mental affliction of ignorance? Okay, keep going. So then the next of these six, the next of these six root mental afflictions is doubt. And Geshe Rabta, I just thought it was interesting. Most translators call it doubt. This translator does, and Hart in his translation does. Geshe Rabtin's translator, I thought was interesting. He calls it afflicted indecision, which I thought was an interesting translation. Afflicted indecision. So I'll read regarding doubt, the Compendium of Knowledge says, so he always does that, right? So what is doubt? It says, this is being two-minded with regard to the truths. It has the function of acting as a support for not engaging in the class of virtue. And I'll read a couple other, I'll read something like Geshe Rabtin said. He called it afflicted indecision. He says, it is a wavering, indecisive state of mind. And he says, to beat one of these root mental afflictions, it must obstruct the development of what is wholesome and induce a disturbed state of mind. So like, so doubt is a state where I like this phrase, two-minded. It's saying it might be this or it may be that, right? It's a kind of uncertainty that wavers between two possibilities. But a few points are being made here. One is, if you have, it says here, it has the function of acting as support for not engaging in virtue, right? So I want to make a few points. One is like, so if you have a doubt about like, whether it's like if you look outside and say, I don't know which, I'm not sure if that's this kind of bird or that kind of bird, or if you look at a certain tree as you're on a hike and say, oh, I'm not sure if that's a sugar maple or whatever, or different. So if it's these two kinds of maple, that wouldn't be the afflicted doubt, because it's not necessarily blocking you. In other words, it has to be something that's blocking you from doing good things with your life and with your day, with your mind. So not all doubts are a mental affliction is the first point. And then I want to explore that a little bit, because remember, I don't know, we talked about this a little bit in the 7 ways of knowing in Pramana. They talk about doubt as one of the 7 ways of knowing. And in that presentation of doubt, which isn't mentioned here, they present 3 types of doubt. There's doubt leading in the wrong direction, there's neutral doubt, and there's doubt leading in the correct direction. And so and those can exist. So, and actually doubt leading in the correct direction can be virtuous. And there's a famous example of that. I'm going to quote Aryadeva again. I was quoting earlier, right? He's a great Madhyamaka thinker. There's a very famous quote from Aryadeva, again from the 400 stanzas, where he's talking about emptiness. And then he basically says, even having a doubt, meaning leading in the correct direction, about this matter, tears samsara to shreds. Right? So he says, and what he's getting at there is, if a person is studying emptiness, right, and they even they get to the level of doubt leading in the correct direction, where they think, I don't totally understand emptiness, but I think it might be right. I think things may be lacking in true existence. I wonder, that seems kind of like it might be true. That's doubt leading in the right direction. They're not yet decided, but they're leaning in that direction. He says, just that tears samsara to shreds. So that's a virtue then, right? Something that tears samsara to shreds is a virtuous state of mind. And why? Actually, because that doesn't act as support for not engaging in virtue, right? A person who develops doubt leading in the correct direction regarding to emptiness says, wow, maybe that's right. Let me study that more. Let me try to understand that better, right? That's actually a virtuous state of mind, because it's encouraging you to do something that will liberate you. So here, there are different debates, I think, that different lamas have had about which types of those 3 types of doubt category can be considered the mental affliction. My own position, I'll just say, I think it's logical to say that if it's either doubt leading in the incorrect direction, right, in the wrong direction, or neutral doubt about something spiritually important, then I think it can categorize. It can meet the criteria for being this type of doubt, right? So it would be like, so I want to say why I think that's important, like from a practical perspective. One is doubt leading in the wrong direction, right? So if you think, like if somebody taught you about karma, right, and you thought, well, karma may be true or maybe not, but I don't really know, and I'm not so sure, and I'm really mad at this person, so I'm just going to go ahead and hurt them. And I could be wrong. Maybe karma is true, but I don't really think so. That would be this kind of doubt, right? And even neutral doubt, you can do that, right? Where you can say, like, what's the word? Like, oh, on an issue of like ethics, right? Well, I'm kind of agnostic. I don't really know if that's going to work or not. So then I'll just do what I want, right? That would be a doubt where where it's blocking you from engaging in virtue. And so the idea here is that that's the point of doubt, though, right? Is that that's when doubt is a mental affliction. It's a kind of, it's a doubt that's unclear, right? And that's uncertain about things, that leaves your mind, as Geshe-Rabdin says, disturbed and prone to not doing what's wholesome, not doing what's healthy for yourself. And of course, and it says here with regard to truths, right? So true things like the 3 jewels or the 4 noble truths, the nature of karma, the nature of emptiness, all those things, right? So if you have doubt about those things, and so what this is getting at, of course, is with regard, what Buddhism is saying is actually, on the one, like, it's kind of tricky, isn't it? Because in other words, if you're certain, if you've been confident of something that's wrong, then it's good to have a doubt, actually. Doubt is a good thing in that sense, right? But what Buddhism is saying here is, with regards to matters of spiritual importance, resolve your doubts, right? Think about it. Don't, like, what's the word? Don't leave it in neutral, or don't leave it in a state of doubt, because you'll waste your life and you'll die before you do anything of importance. So on the one hand, Buddhism isn't saying doubt is bad in general, right? Like, I give examples of doubt. Arya Davis said doubt can tear samsara to shreds. What Buddhism is getting at here is, when you're having doubt with regards to things of spiritual significance, that's really important. Does that make sense? These are like the important questions, and so you should try to resolve them. And I just want to pause there and think about it. Like, what it's getting at also is, like, to know what's important, isn't it? Like, in order to avoid this mental affliction, you have to know what's important in life and take that seriously and really address it. Does that make sense? Like, what's the word? And, like, because sometimes, I don't know, I mean, everybody, I've been thinking about that recently. Like, everybody, what's the word? Everybody focuses on something, don't they? Like, in other words, and everybody tries to get clear about certain things, right? And what Buddhism is asserting is, the most, with this, that, why does that, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that doubt is one of the 6 root mental afflictions. It puts it in that category of the most important ones. And I guess I've thought about that a fair bit. Like, that's it. It's funny. I mean, it's clear why would they include ignorance and hatred and desire? Those are the 3 root mental afflictions, right? But how does doubt get into this category, right, of the 6 roots? And I'm just saying my own opinion now. It doesn't say this here, but well, it doesn't implies it, right? Actually, it does say it here. I'll go into the paragraph, and then I'll comment. I'll say what I'm about to say. It says, just as has been said above, it is a mental factor that wavers between 2 points with regards to the observation of the 4 noble truths, cause and effect of karma, and so forth. This doubt hinders all virtuous activities, and especially hinders seeing the truth. Since it will be overcome when one sees the truth, it is said to be the thorough entanglement that is an object of abandonment of the path of seeing. So I want to say a few things here. It does say that. So what it's saying is, there are a few, I'll get to the path of seeing part in a second, but what this is saying is, it's kind of funny. Put it this way, you're going to die. Like, answer the questions that are really important to answer. What's the word? And, in other words, you have a precious human life, and a mind that's capable of answering these kinds of questions. So answer them, like, figure it out, and if you're not sure about something related to if you're not sure about something related to how to make, how to make a soup or something, who cares? If you're not sure about how to do the best thing for whatever, some other activity, who cares? But with regards to the purpose and meaning of a human life, like, don't leave yourself in doubt. Why? Because it hinders all virtuous activities, and especially hinders you from seeing the truth, right? And those are what's worthwhile. Those are what are worthwhile. Doing virtue and seeing the truth. Doing what's good and seeing the truth are what matter. So don't leave yourself in doubt. Figure out the answer to those questions that are important to you. It's that important, right? And otherwise, what's implying here, it's saying it, is basically, otherwise your life will be wasted, right? So doubt is that serious. That's why it makes the list of top 6. And then it says here, and I already said this. So one point, I'll make a side point here, is Geshe Rabten says, I already said this, but I'll just say it again because it's interesting to think about, is not all doubts are mental afflictions. Afflicted indecision only occurs when the object of doubt is something, the acceptance of which is crucial and valuable to your spiritual development, right? So if you're doubting which, whether this is a gala apple or a golden delicious apple or something, that's not, you can still eat the apple and get nutrition, you're fine. But if it's regarding, like, the nature of impermanence, or the nature of karma, or the nature of the Four Noble Truths, then that's really important. Right. Vasubandhu says, it's action, the function of doubt is to support the failure to pursue those entities that are virtuous in nature, right? Which is interesting phrasing, the failure to pursue. So in other words, again, if you have doubt, you can waste your life. You can not pursue what's actually important to pursue. And then just the last point that he made here is, since it will be overcome when one sees the truth, it is said to be a thorough entanglement that is an object of abandonment of the path of seeing. So what that's getting at is, we've talked about the 5 paths, right? The path of accumulation and preparation, and the path of seeing, and the path of meditation, the path of no more learning. So the path of seeing, it says, when you see the truth, when one sees the truth. The path of seeing is the point where one has direct realization of the emptiness, right? Of the truth of emptiness. And what this is pointing out is, once you've seen emptiness directly, you become free from doubt. That until we get to the path of seeing, we're subject to doubts, right? We can have doubts. And so we have to resolve them through analysis, through logic. Once you achieve the path of seeing, such doubts won't arise anymore. And why is that, right? Actually, well, one is, if you've seen emptiness directly, you won't doubt the truth of emptiness because you've seen it directly. You know it in an absolutely clear way. But when you understood emptiness directly and seen it directly, for example, then you won't doubt the truth of karma. You won't doubt the nature of the 3 jewels, because when you've seen emptiness directly, then you understand directly what emptiness is, and that therefore, that first of all, that is the truth of the Dharma, right? Then you are the Sangha, you are the Arya Sangha, so you know that Sangha exists, and you see that it's possible to become a Buddha, for example, because you've seen emptiness directly, and that's one of the 2 main things that are required to become a Buddha. So you won't have doubts once you've seen emptiness directly, but until then, doubt can arise, and what it's saying is, use analysis and logic to overcome your doubts so that you don't waste time. Any questions about doubt before we go on to the 5 afflicted views? Okay. So then the last, it's kind of fun. The last of the 6 root mental afflictions has 5 subcategories. It's very, very typical of Buddhist texts, I find. It's often like that, right? So you can say, there are 6 root mental afflictions, but in a way there are like 10. If you break these out. But anyway, afflicted views is the next category. And we'll at least cover the first. So the first is what I mentioned earlier, the view of the transitory collection. Remember when I said, I won't explain that term in more detail there because it's coming up. So this is where it's coming up. Here, most translations translate it this way: the view of the transitory collection. Art translated it, the view of the perishable collection. Same idea, right? Or transitory or perishable, something that changes or that doesn't last. So regarding the view of the transitory collection, the compendium of knowledge, again, begins the same way as always. What is the view of the transitory collection? It is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view which views the 5 appropriated aggregates as a real I and mine. It has the function of acting as a support for all views. Now we'll go through this. In the next page, we're going to go through this list: endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view. We're going to go through that. On the next page, he explains that, so I won't explain it here. But actually, let's just keep going, because he explains the definition. So I was about to start explaining the terms of the definition, but he's going to explain them. So I don't need to do that. I'll do it as we go along. So it says, just as it has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom that observes the appropriated aggregates and apprehends them to be a real I and mine. What is the reason for calling this the view of the transitory collection? Just as it has been said in the great exposition of the stages of the past, so Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo. I'll read this quote and then we'll explain. So it says, regarding this, since quote unquote transitory is impermanent and quote unquote collection is manifold, the basis which it views is simply phenomena that are impermanent and manifold. However, one designates the name, the view of the transitory collection, in order to indicate that a permanent and unitary person does not exist. So let's go over it slowly. So the first thing is, regarding what we were talking about earlier in terms of types of ignorance, right? There are passive and active types of ignorance I was mentioning earlier, right? Passive is like, it's just so you don't know something, you never learned about it. And active is an active misapprehension, right? An active seeing wrongly. So this view of the transitory collection is an active misapprehension. It's an actively seeing things wrongly. That's one point worth noting. And then it says here, it's interesting, it says, it is an afflicted wisdom, right? So that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? It's an afflicted intelligence, right? So it's something that's afflicted in the sense that it's wrong. And then what does this mean? Appropriated aggregates. That phrase, and we actually often see that phrase in Buddhism, the appropriated aggregates. Right, so the appropriate aggregates is referring to the 5 aggregates, right? Which we know: form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness, right? And actually, interesting phrase. What does that mean? Appropriated, right? So what it means, sometimes you can say that refers to when you're that one takes them on, right? One takes rebirth in a set of 5 aggregates, right? So, you could say in the Bardo, right? The sperm and the, if you're human, right? The sperm and the egg have met or are meeting, and the consciousness comes and takes and sort of enters them, right? And takes rebirth in them. So you appropriate them, you kind of take them on, right? And one point is it's temporary, right? In other words, your connection to those aggregates of body and mind is a temporary relationship. Anyway, I don't want to go too deeply into the word appropriate, but we could say more about that. But so these aggregates, what it's getting at, right, is these aggregates are, first of all, they're a collection, right? So they're, what does it say? A collection means like they're a bunch of stuff. They're manifold, right? And they're, what's the word? Arts called it perishable, or they're transitory, right? They cease. They're impermanent. They change instant by instant, right? And one has a view that looks at, actually it's interesting, and in all the tenet systems except the Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamaka rather, they say Prasangika is different in a way, but all the other tenet systems of Buddhism say that one looks at the 5 aggregates. That's the object of apprehension, right? Is one or more of the 5 aggregates. And you see, as it says here, a real I and mind there, right? And of course, the implication is, right, there is no real I or mind. Within that, we've done, everybody here, probably, we've all done that kind of meditation, right? So there are all these impermanent phenomena, right? There's atoms and there's whatever, molecules and so on, right? With electrons spinning and so on, whatever. And there's feelings arising, right? Pleasure and pain and neutral, and then again pleasure, and then again pain, right? And there are discriminations. Oh, blue. Oh, wow, that's yellow. Oh, look, there's, and so on, right? So there are all these like impermanent processes, right, that are going on. And what's the word? It says here, manifold, right? A collection. They happen to be collected temporarily. And then we feel there's a real I and mind there. Right? That's what the other tenet systems say is happening is that, so our object of apprehension is one or more of the five aggregates, and then we view a real I and mind there. And the idea here, right, implicit, and it's implicit even in the term, right, the view of the transitory collection, that one is viewing a transitory collection and superimposing a real I and mind where there isn't one. And then Lama Tsongkhapa here is pointing out, right, that even the phrase, right, transitory, in other words, that we view the grossest of the objects of negation is a permanent unitary self, right? And so this phrase is actually, by its very nature, the view of the transitory collection, is refuting that kind of self, right? Because we usually view the self as permanent, but it's transitory, right? And we usually view the self as a unitary, singular thing, but it's a heap, it's a bunch of stuff, right? It's aggregates, it's a manifold, it's a collection. So there's no unitary self, right? And anyway, you get the point here. So it's the very phrase, the view of the transitory collection itself is starting to cut through that grasping at a permanent unitary I. And I'll actually, it's very, what that said there is very similar to something else. Lama Tsongkhapa's quote is very similar to something from Vasubandhu, so I'll read that too, just because I thought it was interesting. It says, those who profess a doctrine of a real self believe the self is both permanent and unitary. Because the object of this view is impermanent and multiple, it makes clear that this object is not such a self. I think that's quite a clear phrasing, so I just like that. Gets at the point, right? That when you assert a self, when you profess a self, you're professing something that's permanent and unitary, but the object you're viewing is impermanent and multiple. So it's very clear there is no such self there, right? I thought that's just a very, very clear phrasing. That's useful. And just that, I mean, just that is amazing, isn't it? So like, just to reflect on that, right? The view of the transitory collection. It's just interesting, I think. And so then he goes on, here the compendium of knowledge explains synonyms, the synonyms, endurance and so forth in the citation above. So remember I said in the definition, it said, is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view. It was kind of an odd list of, I thought, the first time I read that, I thought that's an odd, what does it mean? Endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view, which views the appropriate aggregate? I thought that was like an unusual list the first time I read it. So here he's describing, what does that list mean? So it says here, each of those terms is going to list, it's going to just say a meaning for them. So since it does not fear erroneous meaning, it is called endurance. So this is kind of funny, actually, I think. What it's saying is this, is usually we say, oh, this person's like an endurance runner. They have a lot of endurance, right? Or this person's like, you know, or you have endurance for your work really hard. You have a great endurance. Here, what it's saying is, I find it almost like a joke. It's saying, you're not afraid of, and you have a great deal of endurance for stupidity, basically. You know, so like that's basically what it's saying is like ordinary people who have the view of the transitory collection have incredible endurance for idiotic, wrong things, basically. It's saying, you know, and they're incredibly, you know, in other words, they may be very impatient with others, but they have great patience with regards to ignorance. And so it's saying you have an endurance. So that's why they use this phrase endurance. Is actually, it's funny, it's the way Aryas look at us, I think, is what it's getting at, right? Aryas who've seen emptiness directly look at us and they say, wow, like you can imagine them looking at us and going, oh, these beings have so much like patience for stupidity. Look at them. Like since beginningless time, they've viewed the transitory collection and they never get tired of it. They never even like question it, you know, like amazing. Like this view causes them to be dragged through hell and to hate people and to fight and to spend their whole lives like doing stupid things. And yet they never question it. They just kind of think, oh, that's the way things are. And they have incredible like tolerance for that. So anyway, I mean, we may be calling it a joke, but it's kind of making fun of, in a way, us, right? In a way, it's saying, yeah, so it's saying it does not fear the erroneous mean, right? That we're not afraid of being wrong and of enduring in our, it's one thing to be okay making a mistake. This is saying, actually, this is not just that. This is saying we're not afraid of making the same mistake every instant, you know, from the moment we're born until the moment we die, to make the same mistake, you know, continuously, So it's not just saying, it's one thing to say, oh, I made a mistake and I can learn from it. This is saying it's an endurance that I won't even learn from my mistake. It's that kind of endurance. No matter what, I'll stick with this mistake. So that term endurance is kind of funny, isn't it? So it's saying the endurance of the view of the transitory collection, because it's endured since beginningless time, actually. And in this life, it's endured every instant of our life. Actually, we've never yet been free of the view of the transitory collection. So it's like, wow, that's a lot of endurance. Then it says, why is it called a desire? Because it seeks an erroneous object, right? And we sometimes say in Buddhism, there are actual, there are healthy desires, right? Like the desire to liberate others from suffering, or desire to realize emptiness. But here, then there's then there are kind of afflicted desires. This is obviously an afflicted desire, right? So it says a desire that seeks an erroneous object, right? So you have this view of the transitory collection of yourself, and what it's saying is that's your main desire, actually, right? Even at the moment, it's actually funny, like, there are a lot of things we desire, actually, there are a lot of things we desire, right? Like, whatever, wealth and friendship and stuff and all that, right? But this is the deepest desire. Even when you're dying, you still hold on to this one, right? I want to continue to exist. Actually, it's funny, like a simpler example. It seeks an erroneous, like we all have maybe attachment to food, right? But if you're like holding onto the toilet vomiting, you don't want any food, but you're still grasping, desiring yourself. Does that make sense? You still grasp this. This is desire that we never let go of. And so it's like, it's a desire for erroneous object, meaning a desire for self, for I and mine, right? So it's a kind of desire. Then it says, and this again, I think, this is my personal sense of, my warped sense of humor, but I think he's being funny, kind of. He calls it an intelligence. It's kind of funny, right? So, but it's an afflicted intelligence, right? It's funny to call it an intelligence because it's an afflicted intelligence that I'll say it this way. It says here, since it thoroughly discriminates that object, it's called an intelligence, right? But what it's thoroughly discriminating is a non-existent object, right? So it's like an intelligence that, actually, it's like much of our intelligence, right? Like, so it's an intelligence that is very intelligent with regards to something that doesn't exist at all. So that's why it's called an intelligence. So these terms are kind of, what's the word, maybe a little ironic. I don't know what word to use. I don't think Lamas would use that word, ironic, but it's an intelligence, but again, it's an intelligence that's discriminating or discerning something that doesn't exist at all, right? Then why is it called a conception? Because it strongly adheres to that object, right? So it's saying not only does it desire an object and discriminate an object, but it adheres to, and it grasps at, or it adheres to, it holds on to. And adheres is a powerful word, right? But it does. In other words, that our mind, what's the word? It's like, what's this kind of glue where if you try to separate the thing, you'll rip the thing apart. It's like that. We adhere that strongly to this view of the. It's actually not. And one thing point is that the view of the transitory collection is not in the nature of mind, right? It can be removed from the mind. But we adhere to it like incredibly strongly. So that's why it's called a conception, right? We grasp at that object very strongly. And then it says it's called a view since it observes that object, right? So in other words, what's it viewing? So we say the view of the transitory collection because what it's viewing is viewing a real I and mine, right? That's what it's looking at. And again, it's viewing something, it's viewing the real I and mine, which are non-existence. So that's an interesting, again, like when I first, if you first read, like when I read on the previous page, right, it is any endurance, desire, intelligence, conception, or view, which views the five appropriate areas as a real I and mine. You go, what's he talking about? Why endurance, desire? Now we get the sense, right? That's why he's using all those different terms. The author is using all those different terms. Is getting at different qualities of how we insanely grasp at this thing, the real I and mine. Another quick point I want to make is the view of the transitory collection specifically refers, I just want to point something out because I don't think you said it yet explicitly, it's implied, is it's specifically in relation to your own self. So in other words, one point is like, we view like, we have the view of like an intrinsically real tree. That's not the view of the transitory collection. That's a kind of that is a kind of ignorance grasping at grasping at true existence, but it's not the view of the transitory collection, because the view of the transitory collection is always in relation to yourself. So also, like if I were to grasp at, which I do, I guess actually, when I grasp at the at a real Lisa, that's not the view of the transitory collection. It's when Lisa views it, when Lisa grasps at a real Lisa, then that's the view of the transitory collection. When I grasp at a real Lauren, then that's the view of the transitory collection. So it's one point is the view of the transitory collection is not in reference to inanimate objects, but it's also not, it's not in reference to something outside yourself, and it's also not in reference to another person. It's the view of it's a view of yourself being real. And then mine, they sometimes debate this. I've seen different debates, but in general, what they're talking about is and we'll get into this in a minute, but in general, it's mine in relation to the aggregates. So it's like my body, my mind, my feelings, and so on. Some people have debated, can it include like my pen or my hat or whatever? But I think the main reference here is when we say I and mine is the, and that once sometimes they talk about it that way though, like that there's not a once you realize there's not a real I, then you realize there's not objects of use of a real I, is another way of saying it. So it's like, so it's this idea that the real I, and anyway, there are different views on whether it includes things outside of your aggregates, but at the minimum, it includes your aggregates, right? So like, my body, my mind, so on. And we'll get into that in a minute, but I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not, I think it's the point of debate. Different lamas take different positions. So if I were to say there's a real I and this is my cup or something, would that sense of my be the view of the transitory collection? And I'm not quite sure, because I think different lamas take different positions on that. But the main reference is to the intrinsically real self and to the aggregates as being mine. So then it says, the view of the transitory collection has the function of acting as support for all bad views. Right? So from it come all the other bad views. So it's that kind of ignorance. And then he quotes Guyadatta's expression of the realization of the 7 maidens, which says, when will we eradicate the view of the transitory collection, the mother of all views, and no longer desire the enjoyments of cyclic existence? So it's interesting, it's making the same point we made before, right? That actually, it's funny though, the metaphor of mother is an interesting one, because like usually mother in Buddhism refers to wisdom, right? The wisdom of emptiness is the mother of all liberation. But here it would be a different kind of mother, the opposite. The source, in other words, that which gives birth to all the other afflictions, all the other views. But it says here, when we eradicate this view, then all other views will be overcome, and will no longer will generate renunciation, essentially, right? We'll eventually become liberated by overcoming this view. Now he gets into something which we'll talk about a little bit, which are I'm sure, is there a phrase here? When this view of the transitory collection is divided, there are 20 types of views of the transitory collection. So this is like a traditional, what's the word? Again, Buddhism's quite Buddhism does a lot of, right? There are many lists in Buddhism, aren't there? I think actually part of that, I'll just mention, I think a part of that is, it's interesting. It was Buddhism, well, first of all, it's getting at details. Another is you have to relate them back to experience, to our own experience. They're not just lists for some kind of external purpose. But also, Buddhism was for a long time mostly an oral tradition, so it was also, they would memorize these. But this one's not too hard to remember, because once you get what the four are, it's 4 times the 5 aggregates. So it'll be 4 ways of positing something, and then you do them in relation to each of the 5 aggregates. So when this view of the transitory collection is divided, there are 20 types of view of the transitory collection. View of forms as a self, view of the self as possessing forms, view of forms as mine, and view of the self as abiding in forms. Similarly, due to the divisions into 4 each with respect to feelings, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness, the remaining 4 of the 5 aggregates, there are 20 views altogether. So again, it's 4 times 5 makes 20. That's easy math, at least. But so again, I want to go slow here and what is this actually getting at? And you'll see he'll list then view of feelings as self and so on, and then views of, then it goes through the same kinds of lists. But actually, I want to jump down and quote Nagarjuna for a second, because he does, and then sort of go back and talk about it. So Nagarjuna, in his letter to a friend, says, "It is taught that form is not the self. The self does not possess form. The self does not abide in form. Form does not abide in the self. Realize likewise the remaining 4 aggregates are also empty." Right? So that's getting at the same point. I mean, Nagarjuna there is getting at the same 20 kinds of selflessness, or 20 kinds, there he's talking about selflessness, but the 20 kinds of overcoming of the view of the transitory collection. Right? And the reason why I wanted to slow down here is, again, it would be easy to look at these, and sometimes we do, I think. We look at things like this and just go, oh, Buddhism's making a list. Something. But it's actually getting at experiences, right? And I just want to kind of pause and reflect on it together, because I actually think, what is the view of the transitory? We talk about this thing, the view of the transitory collection, right? And it can, you understood, I think, smart people, and you understood the terms here. But it's not getting at something like, what's the word? I mean, it is getting at something philosophical, but it's also getting at something intimate to our everyday experience. Actually, the most intimate thing there is to our everyday experience. And so where it says form is not the self, right? Or viewing form as the self. What is that, right? And I just want to say, if you if you look in the mirror and you think, oh, I don't look good today, that's viewing the form as a self, right? Or when you see somebody who's what's the word, about their appearance, whether it be because they think they're very fit, or because they think they're very beautiful, or something, whatever, very strong, they're cocky, sort of right? And they're feeling, you can tell, right? The person in that moment is feeling, wow, I look, wow, I'm strong. Wow, I look great. Wow, I'm, in regards to their form, right? That's the view of the transitory collection with regards to, form as the self, right? And we have those feelings, we say, and it could be a positive feeling, wow, I look great, or it could be a bad feeling, oh my gosh, I look so old, or oh, I look tired today, or I have a bad, whatever it is, something like that, right? And then do you feel it? I just want to check, we have all had moments like that about whatever the variations may be. There are infinite variations about our form that different people can have. But do you feel it, how that arises, right? You can feel that, you identify with the form as a self. And do you see how quickly you give rise to other mental afflictions then, right? Pride, arrogance, or fear, or, right? And actually, so it could be a positive feeling, arrogance. I mean, not positive in the sense good, it's bad actually, but it could be arrogance and pride, or it could be terror, or it could be like low self-esteem, but they all come from, which is a kind of pride, as we covered, right? But they all come from those. I mean, one version of those is viewing form as the self, right? And yeah, and doesn't happen also, like, if you're, there's this version of that, like when you're sick, right? You feel, I'm sick, and then it could feel like, disturbing, right? Viewing form as the self, right? So my point is like just that one. I'm only covering the first of the 20, but do you see how deep that goes, and how fundamental that is, and how pervasive that is, right? Like, and that's why you can see, I just want to point out, right? It's more fundamental. Like I gave the example earlier, like we all have, uh, all kinds of desires, right? But if you're, again, I gave the example earlier, if you're in the middle of vomiting, one thing that happens is, your other desire, like in other words, if you have a lot of like desire for food or for sexuality or for something, in the middle of vomiting, all those kind of fall away. But your view of the transitory collection of a self as the form itself won't fall away. It'll actually get stronger. It's always there, right? But it's actually, you can feel it very vividly. Oh no, this is terrible. I'm sick. What's wrong with me? Right, or something, right? Like, so do you see why this one's so fundamental? Like, and we said it, we adhere to it. Remember that phrase, adhere? We have, I still find that one funny. Endurance, that we're very patient. Whereas even in the middle of vomiting, we're patient enough that we hold on to our view of the transitory collection. That we never give up on. So we have incredible patience with regards to the ignorance. We're not patient with other people, but we're very patient with our own ignorance. In other words, without even realizing it. So that's the one, that form is the self, right? And do you see how, I just want to pause, that is so fundamental, right, to our experience in the world, and it's not something intellectual, right? It's something like, when you feel, like when you were a teenager and you felt self-conscious because of how you looked, right? That was the view of the transitory collection. When you were a little kid and you thought, well, yeah, anyway, all kinds of, it's from the time of childhood on all the way until the day you die, you have that, right? When you're, when somebody's like looking at their body and whether you're a little kid thinking, oh, I wish I'm like this, or when you're in, nearing death and you're, it's always there, right? And that's one form of it, the view of form as the self. And then that's different from the second one, right? Which is the self as possessing forms, or in Nagarjuna, the self does not possess form. And that feels a little different. I just want to point out, but it's another version of, it's just a variation, but it's getting at experiential differences in the way the view of the transitory collection manifests in real life. And that's why I want to emphasize this point, is this is not something just intellectual. And that's where you feel my, right? Like, so you feel my body. We talk that way, right? So the viewing, as possessing form is like where you feel like, it's so funny, like, oh wow, my hair looks good today, or oh my, oh my, and actually, and the point is like, like, I don't know, like, yeah, if you went to work without realizing that there was something really weird about your hair and that you couldn't fix it, right? Think how you would feel, like I said, and that everybody was going to see you, right? And you couldn't fix something about your hair. I'm just giving you an example, whatever. Like, and you hadn't been aware. Like, there would be this deep feeling, wouldn't there be, of like self-consciousness, I guess, or something, or you would feel very self-conscious, maybe, right? And you might feel, oh my goodness, my hair looks horrible today. And you see how like it's connected to this view of the transitory, that's a my, that, that's the truly existent my, right? That there's somehow, and the feeling is there's an I that truly, there's an I that exists that truly owns the hair, right? That there's like a truly existent I that somehow is separate from, but is the owner of. And do you see how deep that goes, right? Like, I'm just giving, there are lots, I can make countless examples, right? But it's where you feel that the self exists, but, and it's that we say that all the time, don't we? My, right? Like, we could do it also, I'm using body, right? But we also do it with like my mind, right? Like, oh, my mind isn't, like sometimes we say, it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes we say, oh, I'm not thinking clearly, right? And sometimes we say, my mind isn't so clear today. It's two different ways we grasp at a self, but they're both the view of the transitory collection. And they're both things we do in this kind of very instinctive way, is what this is getting at. And I just want to separate here. It's just kind of interesting. Nagarjuna's phrasing is interesting, where he says the self is not in form. Sometimes it feels that way, which is different than possessing, right? Sometimes it feels like that the self is in the aggregates, and that's where the Dalai Lama points this out. It's funny. He says, like, sometimes people, one way of getting at that one, that experience of feeling like this, it's experiential, right? But feeling like the self is in form or in the aggregates is where you feel like you would trade them in if you could. There are movies like that, aren't there, where people like get a different set of aggregates or something, where you would feel like, if you're getting older, you feel like, oh wow, I wish I could have a body like that, like, or something. Or it might be at any point in your life, I guess. Actually, it's funny, when you're young, you might think that about somebody older, right? Like, if you're young and then you actually, it's funny, isn't it? When little kids, they think, oh, I wish I could trade in for that. If I'm 12, I wish I could trade in for a 16-year-old, something. And then when you get to be older, you might think, oh, I wish I could trade back and be like when I was in my 20s or something. So it feels like there's a self that's real, that somehow, and it's weird, right? It's the view, getting back to the view of the transitory collection, right? What's actually happening is there's a bunch of stuff that's changing instant by instant, as we said, transitory collection, right? But our feeling, right, which is our view, our endurance, our afflicted intelligence, is that there's some kind of real self there that's in there, right? And that and then that's where the thing you think, oh, if I could, I would trade in this, I would trade it in for a smarter mind. I would trade in my mind for a smarter mind, or I would trade in my body for a stronger body, or a healthier body, or a younger body, or older, whatever. You see the point there? It's like a way that the view experientially manifests. And part of the point here is, I'm slowing down at this point, because it's useful to actually pause and notice these and go, oh, I do that, and how weird that is. In other words, and it reflects my own ignorance, that I think there's something there beyond the transitory collection, right? That's separate from the transitory collection, that could somehow, and it's just because and I'm going back, it's because of our endurance. Again, I think that phrase is funny. That and our desire, right? That we desire this erroneous object, right? And we want to protect it. We'd like to give it a better set of aggregates, but it doesn't exist, right? And as the Madhyamikas say, the I is merely labeled, right? But we think it's something real there that, anyway, in this case, that is in the aggregate, right? In form, or in feeling, or in discrimination, or in consciousness. And then the last one, right, and I'm using Nagarjuna's phrase here, that form is not in the self. And that's another kind of feeling that happens sometimes, where one feels like, and actually that one's more like some kind of feeling as if the self is this, what's the word? That could be actually, first of all, that could be like this kind of a philosophical view, like kind of a view of a soul, but it can also be an experience, like that you feel like there's this self that's bigger somehow than the aggregates, right? And that all the aggregates are somehow like within that big self, that you are, right? I was thinking, somehow popped in my mind, like, Emerson's view of the, what do you call it, the transparent eyeball or something, right? This kind of like, he had this experience of like a kind of a vast self that was like looking at everything, and that he was this vast self that was seeing all, seeing himself and other things, and that there was this kind of vast self that was sort of the seer, and that all the aggregates and stuff existed within that. And what Buddhism would say is that's the view of the transitory collection. Again, now you're projecting it as this sort of big thing that everything's within, but it's just another view of of viewing a self where there isn't one, actually, right? It's just an experience, and then you're imputing and grasping at, and using his phrases here, right? You're desiring, you're having a conception of, you're having a view of a real self where there isn't one. So do you see the point here? And I just want to also say, so, and what he's getting at in this list of 20 is, because we're just like, this is, again, I my favorite of that, you can probably tell, my favorite of that list of things is the endurance one. I just think that one's quite funny, because it's like, we have so much patience for our own ignorance. We have so much endurance. It endures so well that you can project it onto anything, right? Like a giant eyeball experience in the sky, or your own body, or your hairdo, or your, like, again, if we feel tired, right, then we feel I'm tired, or sometimes we feel, like, and then we identify with that, and we say that's myself, and we impute a self onto that. We do it with regards to everything. Is the point. Like, there's any stupid thing that arises, and that's why I think that phrase endurance is kind of, it's getting at like something for me that resonates, I guess, which is like, it's just weird if you actually step back and look at what we do, right? Like that we project it onto all kinds of things. And that's why this list of 20, right, is like that sometimes we project it onto our compositional factors, right? Sometimes we project it onto our consciousness. Sometimes we project it onto our form. Sometimes we project it onto our feelings, right? Like, if you're feeling really, what's the word? Unhappy, right? Then you may project it onto that. I'm unhappy, right? A feeling of displeasure, right? And you identify strongly with that, then you can build a whole, actually, people can do that. Sometimes, yeah, even as a psychologist, I've seen that where somebody gets a habit of identifying the view of the transitory collection with unhappiness, right? And then if they start to feel happiness, they say, that's not me. I don't feel like myself. Something's wrong. And it's just because you've gotten like a habit of viewing the transitory collection as one thing, but it's transitory. So it never was that, anyway, that's Sujata.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm confused about if you could differentiate between 2 and 3 in that list. I'm having a little trouble with the difference between those two. The view of the self as possessing forms, and then the view of the forms as mine. Is it just like what it is that we're looking at? We're looking at the forms versus the self as the sort of the subject of that, or? Yeah, I'm trying to find a clear way to work with the difference between the two.
So for me, what I find easier, more helpful. I don't know. I was thinking the same question sometimes, and for me, if I look at Nagarjuna's list, it's a little easier, because the self not possessing form would be like, my body. That's very clear, right? Like, it's like, oh, my nose looks weird or something, right? Like, then you feel self-conscious, whatever. Like, that would be the possessing. Whereas I think rather like, oops. So that's 2. Then 3, where it says mine. I think in English, it's a little tricky because possessing and mine implies something quite similar. So I find Nagarjuna's list where he says self not abiding in form. So I would call, so for me personally, that's an easier, and Chandrakirti calls it self not in form, which I'm abiding in. So I take it, I use Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna's phrasing. So one is possessing, like mine, or the other is feeling like I'm in there. And that's why I was giving the example, like if you felt like I would trade it in, right? Like some feeling that there's a self in there, in the form, that you would then trade in and give to a different form or something. I think that's a clearer differentiation than, it's the word mine implies to me in English possession, but I think if you take the view of forms as mine in the sense of the way Nagarjuna says it, which is as if there's a form, as if there's a self in the form, because that's how Nagarjuna says it, abiding in a self, that as if there's a self in there, that there's a slight different feeling in the sense one is like an ownership, or the other is like you're in there, like almost like in a house or something.
But then I'm sorry, that feels like the same as the number 4 then. That's the way I was understanding the self as abiding in forms, like that there's an I that Do you
Oh,
know,
and look at
is
that's
this?
interesting. If you look at Nagarjuna's, this is slightly different because he says form does not abide in the self. So he actually glosses that one differently. So as if the self is something bigger than the form that the form can abide within. And Chandrakirti takes it that way also. So I find Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna's list easier to grasp, but from an experiential perspective.
Yeah. I feel like one is missing though somehow. Like I don't see the form is not the self does not possess the form, the self does not abide in the form, and the form does not abide in the self. Okay. I'll keep playing with it.
Yeah, I would, because I find it easier to use their list for myself, because I think the other one for me was less, it's easier to use the way they phrase it, at least, to get the experience for me personally.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah. Other questions? Lynn. Yeah.
It seems to me that this whole idea of the self different than the forms is a form of alienation in some way, a little bit like what the doubt was. I mean, the doubt is alienation from the truth. And this is sort of just another, not just, another form of that.
Say more about this word. That's an interesting phrase you're using, alienation. Like, say more what you mean, because that's a kind of interesting phrase or interesting word.
Because the doubt is when you become detached from seeing the truth or the truth, seeing the truth. Okay, so it reminds me of a lot of intellectuals. They get up in their head and they don't see the truth. They're very alienated. And then you get to the transitory collection, which sees two things that are inherently empty, forms and self, and somehow is alienated from both. So it combines them in different ways. I'm not saying this very well, but it's not seeing either as empty. It's seeing them as separate and in these combinations, neither of which is truth.
Yeah, because part of how I'm taking what you're saying and tell me, like, one is I think that's an interesting way to phrase it, and to me it's implying something for me at least, which is that it's an alienation in a way, or a missing of, because the solution to this, as Tsongkhapa said in the previous section, is seeing the view of dependent origination. There's when you recognize that in other words, the real self doesn't exist. There is this kind of fictionalized projection, but that there is a self which arises in dependence upon the five aggregates, and that it's and according to the Madhyamaka view, it's a Prasangika view, it's a merely labeled phenomenon, something that's labeled upon the mere appearance of the five aggregates. Then you're understanding a kind of interdependence.
Right.
Whereas this is missing the interdependence. You're not seeing interdependence. You're just seeing as kind of, that there's a self and somehow, So that's the way I take what you're saying, is kind of that it's missing. The alienation is an alienation away from the truth of interdependence or dependent arising.
Right. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. Exactly. It's like everything is independent and nothing is really related. So you see it as atomized, sort of.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So, and the idea is that's why Tsongkhapa was saying, so the solution, in other words, the antidote to the view of the transitory collection, the ultimate antidote is dependent arising, actually, is understanding how things arise in mutual interdependence, or in a mutually dependent manner. And when you understand that, then you become free of, actually, that's the way to become free. The ultimate way to become free of the view of the transitory collection is by seeing, I'll call it, mutual interdependence. So I think that gets at what you're getting at in a way.
And maybe this is not the right analogy, but this balloon over the west of the US.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea that, they want to shoot it down because they think it's looking at them. These individual Republicans want to shoot this thing down. And it's
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they say it's not really looking at you, but there's such a definite view of the self and this balloon that's looking at you, that's outside you. And it just has no bearing to what this balloon is doing, whatever it is.
Huh.
but it's like this personalization is that balloon is looking at me. And it's, I worry more about government surveillance than the balloon. So the whole thing is just twisted. It's a twisted way of seeing the world. I guess that's what I'm saying. So it's sort of an analogy to me of this, seeing these forms as outside yourself, or these forms in yourself, or without seeing that there's a reality or a truth that's interconnected that has nothing to do with the balloon being separate from you.
That's fun.
I don't know. Maybe that's
No, I get it. It's kind of reminds me of what they say actually, and Buddhism says is that, you know, once you have the view of, it's actually, they say it in here where it says it's the root of all views. You know, they said that one quote was that it said in the text here, the view of the transcendent is the root of all views. And one thing, sometimes they elaborate on that, and they make a point that once you have the view of the transitory collection, you can, there are infinite elaborations. In other words, you can have infinite elaborations of views, and there's no limit. In other words, you can make up any, and it's like insane, you know, like that we can make up all kind, and we can make up an infinite number of insane views, and we do. We even, I mean, it's not just, that's not even far-fetched. We can actually observe every day people, we all do that, or people do that, you know, and they could be, you know, and you, I mean, for me anyway, I guess that sometimes it helps to go back to this Buddhist teaching, because, you know, sometimes that you look and you think, like, if you look at human history and you think, oh my goodness, how could people have, you know, whether it be in the current time or in past times, you think, how could people have thought this? You know, like, there's so many things that we all, as human beings, have grasped at. And what Buddhism is saying is, once you have the view of the transitory collection, you can elaborate infinitely to, you know, they wouldn't use this term, but infinite stupidity is possible, infinite ignorance, infinite, you know, that you can make up anything, you know, and eventually believe it, because, yeah, once you view that there's a self, you know, then there's going to be other, and then there's going to be elaborations of self and other, and, you know, you can do it based on all kinds of things. So I actually think what you're saying is connected to that, you know, is that there are these limitless elaborations of ignorance once you have the view of the transitory collection, that can then lead to hatred and fear and, you know, us and them and desire and hate, you know, all those, you know, and that there's literally no limit to the basis, right? You can make it based on anything. And it's true. I mean, you know, it's just, I mean, anyway, you know, when they did those, it just reminded me of when they, you know, they would do those studies after World War II, where they would like try to understand why World War II happened, right? And they would have people put in groups, and they found that, yeah, once you can put people in random groups, and in a few minutes, or, you know, in a very short amount of time, they'll over-identify with the group, and then they'll start to hate, you know, or do mean things to people in another group if you set it up in a certain way. You know, because and again, somebody who didn't have the view of the transitory collection wouldn't do that. But once you have the view of the transitory collection, it's like, yeah, anyway, it's disturbing. But it's a motivator to try to overcome the view of the transitory collection. Oh, and then Frank.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering how similar or different are these reasonings to the basic meditation on emptiness, where you say, okay, there's only two ways for the self or the I to exist. It's either your transitory collection, your mind and your body, or it's something else. And then you go through the reasonings of, you know, well, if it was the mind and body, then there would have to be several cells, et cetera, et cetera. You eliminate that option, and then you say, well, if it was different, you take away the mind, you should be able to see it somewhere, and you can't. So then you come. So I was just curious, because there seem to be some similarities here, but it also seems different.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think that reasoning is like, you know, they use they what's the word, boil these down to two, you know, and then in this particular quote from Nagarjuna, it elaborates out into 4 versions, and it's just getting it. Really, I mean, they all boil down to those 2, but here he's elaborating on to 4 in order to sort of just get at different experiences or different variations of the experience of view of transitory collection or self-grasping. You know, and there's a version where they elaborate out into 7 different one, you know, so, and you know, or you can do it into 20 if you do like this whole list. But they all come down to the same. Yeah, I think they all come down to those 2. In other words, you could summarize all of these into those 2 logical questions, or you can elaborate them out into different variations, and it's just different ways to kind of but they can all get to the same point. Yeah, so all these different elaborations could be summarized into those two.
Okay, thanks.
Other question? I'll just continue. I'll just quote. I didn't actually read Chandrakirti. He was getting at the same point, but he says form is not the self does not possess form, the self is not in form, and form also is not in the self. And again, I find, like Sujata's question, I find that phrasing easier than the other phrasing. Then he says, thus all the aggregates should be known in these four ways. These are asserted to be the 20 views of the self. The Vajra realizing selflessness destroys the mountain of views. And that's getting at what I was, Lynn's point, right? A mountain of views. In other words, once you have those, it's like the view of the transitory collection is like the starting point, but then you can have a whole mountain or a whole mountain range or whole planets of views, whatever. These high peaks of the huge mountain range of the view of the transitory collection are destroyed together with the self, right? So once you realize selflessness, and that's the key point, right? Once you realize selflessness of persons, of yourself, all these different elaborations of the view of the transitory collection, like huge mountain range, are wiped out. And the good news, actually, in one way, it's kind of funny. In one way, right, it is like a mountain range, right? In other words, actually, it's weird, isn't it? Like, I mean, Lynn's point about the balloon gets at that, but there are infinite variations of suffering that can come from the view of transitory collection. It can seem like an endless, like some kind of endless mountain range. But the good news is the view of the transitory collection, as we said earlier, is a view of something that doesn't exist. So once you get, the good news is once you get rid of it, it's like the whole mountain range disappears all at once, because because it's based on something that's wrong. Actually, it's not even, it's based on a wrong understanding. And here we go. And then it says, then it says the view of the transitory collection are said to be subsumed in two, the conceptions of I and mine. And one way of viewing it actually is like, actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? If you think of it from what Frank was saying, I would be that the one I is, one way, well, I'm not sure we can identify it that way, but I more often tends to be that the I is one with the aggregates, and mine would imply it's separate from the aggregates. As soon as you start to say mine, you're implying there's an I separate, that's for sure. You could say there's an I that's, anyway, once you say mine, for sure, you're saying there's an I that's separate from the aggregates is one point. Because it's the aggregates are mine, that implies that, which is one of the two, so I think you can summarize all these into those two logical points. And then he says, our author says, if you wish to understand their identities in detail, you should know them from the root text and the self-commentary to the compendium of knowledge, as well as from Tsongkhapa's illumination of thought, the explanation to the supplement of the middle way, to supplement to the middle way, which is actually was just published last year in English by Thupten Jinpa's translation. Beautiful. The illumination of thought, which is a commentary to Chandrakirti's Majjhimaka Avatara, and you can read it. It's actually I decided last year to read that, and it was like, actually my good friend Wilson and I were both reading at the same time. We were both saying, like, we would have this experience, like you'd read like a quarter of a page or something, and you'd have to sit and think for like a half hour to like go like, wow, what's he saying? But that was fun to read. It's a wonderful text. So I recommend it. Jinpa's translation is quite beautiful, quite well done. And Jeffrey Hopkins has translated sections of it, but not the whole text. I think it's called, I forget what the name of the book is. Anyway, he has a translation of parts of it, but it never came out in complete version in English till last year by Thupten Jinpa. It's part of the Library of Tibetan Classics, so it's called. I think the Library of Tibetan Classics. Jinpa's amazing, right? Like he's already got like a whole shelf of them done, and I think he's only like there's still many more to come, volumes of that to come. But yeah, we'll stop there. So, next time we'll we'll go through the rest of the afflicted views. Yeah. And I know we already have another class scheduled for this month. It's not next week. It's so it's in 2 weeks on the 18th. And I guess I was just looking at that. I guess I'll send out soon the schedule for March, at least, maybe March and April, because I just realized I should do that. So I'll send that out in the next little while. But let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their own side to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody. Good to see y'all.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Good week.
Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.